You've been doing everything right every morning, years of it, and you're still waking up tired. Your joints are stiffer than they were 3 years ago. The energy that was supposed to come from the exercise, it comes, but it costs more now than it did. And when you mention it, you get the same thing back every time. That's just aging. It's not aging. It's a timing problem. And the window where it's happening every single morning is 90 minutes long. Here's what's actually running in your body before you've touched your shoes. The first 90 minutes after waking is not just morning. Your body doesn't experience it that way. It's a biological transition. 3 processes running simultaneously, all of them mid-comp completion. The first process is cellular repair. During overnight fasting, your cells run a maintenance process called autophagy. Damaged proteins, dysfunctional components, and accumulated debris are identified, dismantled, and recycled. The fasting state, low insulin and low mTOR, signaling let the cleanup machinery run at capacity. This doesn't stop when your alarm goes off. It continues into the early waking hours until you eat. Your first meal ends it, not gradually. mTOR activates and the repair window closes. That window is still open at 7 a.m. when most people lace their shoes. The second process is your cortisol awakening response. Cortisol starts rising about 30 minutes before you open your eyes, not stress, but mobilization. It's activating immune function and preparing your cardiovascular system, and it is your body's primary endogenous anti-inflammatory. The morning surge is what suppresses the inflammatory markers that accumulate overnight. That suppression is what makes the morning window manageable for physical stress. After 65, that response is blunted. Research comparing the cortisol awakening response in young adults versus adults aged 65 to 88 found significantly lower peaks, flatter curves, and slower stabilization in the older group. The anti-inflammatory suppression that should reduce your morning inflammatory baseline is running at a fraction of what it was 20 years ago. The third is circadian calibration. Your body's master clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, is receiving its primary timing signal in the first 30 to 60 minutes after waking. That signal is natural light through your eyes. It sets the timing and magnitude of the cortisol response, activates the anti-inflammatory cascade, and coordinates the cellular processes still finishing from overnight. What matters about these 3 processes isn't any one of them in isolation. It's that they're interdependent. The cortisol response depends on the circadian signal firing correctly. The cellular repair window depends on the cortisol curve not being disrupted prematurely by acute physical stress. Pull one out of sequence and the downstream effects run through all 3. They're not parallel systems you can manage independently. They complete together or they're all compromised. 3 systems, all mid-process, all connected. Most people are exercising directly into the middle of that. Let's be specific about what aging has done to your morning, because this is the part that never gets explained. And it's why the timing matters specifically after 65 and not before. Inflammation rises with age documented across decades. The inflammatory markers are measurably higher at baseline in older adults. The medical literature calls it inflammaging, not a side effect of aging. One of its primary drivers, the chronic low-grade inflammatory state that accumulates with age, is directly tied to cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, and accelerated biological aging. Your morning is when inflammaging is either managed or amplified every day. Here's the sequence. You wake up with a higher inflammatory baseline than you had at 45. Your cortisol awakening response, the system built to suppress that baseline, is blunted. The suppression that should happen in the first hour is happening at reduced capacity. The baseline stays elevated longer than it should. Into that elevated inflammation, insufficient suppression and cellular repair still running, you introduce high intensity physical stress. Exercise generates inflammation in a body with adequate anti-inflammatory capacity and a well-functioning morning transition. That signal is managed, resolved, and converted into adaptation. That's how fitness works. But in a body over 65, before the cortisol curve has stabilized, that inflammatory signal lands on a baseline the aging body is already struggling to manage. It doesn't resolve cleanly. What happens instead is a resolution deficit, not a failure, not a crisis, just an incomplete clearing. The inflammatory signal from the workout doesn't fully dissipate before the next morning's baseline is set. Each day begins slightly higher than it should. That increment is too small to show on any single blood panel, too small to feel on any single morning. It accumulates across the timeline of a habit, not dramatically, but across years of daily repetition. It compounds the fatigue your doctor attributes to age, the joint stiffness, the inflammation on your panels that keeps getting noted and filed under getting older. Some of it is age, some of it is the output of years of the right exercise at the wrong biological hour. The distinction matters because one of those is fixed and one of those isn't. Age is not a lever, the biological hour is. And the people who understand that distinction early enough are the ones whose 75-year-old body is running optimally. They are running the inflammatory profile of someone 10 years younger, not because they found a better supplement or a different exercise, but because they understood that the same input produces a completely different biological output depending on when in the morning it arrives. Here's the problem with how this gets monitored. Your standard annual physical measures a specific set of markers: cholesterol, blood pressure, blood glucose, and a basic metabolic panel. These are the instruments your doctor uses to assess your cardiovascular health and your organ markers. They're useful instruments, and the research behind them is solid, and they will show the cardiovascular benefits of your exercise habit clearly because those benefits are real and those markers capture them accurately. What they don't capture is inflammaging. HSCP is sometimes included, sometimes flagged, but rarely explained in the context of biological aging. IL-6 and TNF-alpha, the deeper inflammatory cytokines most directly tied to inflammaging, are almost never ordered on a routine panel. They're not part of the standard screening framework. You would have to know to ask and then find a physician willing to order them outside the standard protocol. Epigenetic clocks, the DNA, methylation assays that measure biological age independently of chronological age are not yet part of any routine clinical workflow. They exist. The research behind them is substantial. They predict mortality and functional decline with accuracy that chronological age alone cannot match, but they're not in the system your doctor works from. So what gets measured is what gets managed, and what isn't measured continues running in the background, accumulating, compounding, eventually showing up as the symptoms that get attributed to the decade you're in. The monitoring gap isn't a failure of your physician. It's a structural feature of a system that hasn't caught up to the tools now available to measure what's actually happening in an aging body. Bernard's HSCP was noted, but nobody ordered the follow-up that would have told the complete story. The standard panel said what it was designed to say. It just wasn't designed to ask the question that matters most after 65. There's a light problem underneath all of this, and it's making everything worse upstream. A study capturing roughly 13 million hours of personal light sensor data found a critical pattern. Brighter days and darker nights predicted significantly lower mortality risk, independent of age, lifestyle, or socioeconomic factors. The mechanism runs through the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Natural morning light through your eyes in the first 30 to 60 minutes of waking sets the timing and magnitude of your cortisol awakening response. That response, the one that's already blunted after 65, depends on that signal. Firing correctly, a 60-year-old receives approximately 1/3 of the daily light exposure a 20-year-old does. The aging lens transmits less. Older adults spend more time indoors. The circadian signal is being progressively weakened at exactly the age its precision matters. Most weaker signal, more blunted response, less anti-inflammatory suppression. Higher effective inflammatory baseline when exercise lands. One problem: single upstream, cause fixable in 5 minutes. But most people over 65 wake up, check their phone, make coffee under artificial light, and head out for their walk. The circadian signal that should have fired in the first 20 minutes fired partially at best. The cortisol response hasn't peaked. The anti-inflammatory cascade is running incomplete. And then the walk begins. There's something else the phone does in those first 20 minutes that the research doesn't let slide past. Stress. Inducing content like news and notifications produces a cortisol spike that actively disrupts the natural awakening response. When the amygdala fires first, it doesn't add to the response, it preempts it. the shape of the curve changes. Instead of the slow, sustained rise that produces anti-inflammatory suppression, you get a sharp spike followed by an accelerated drop. The suppression window collapses before it's done its work. You are suppressing your own anti-inflammatory system before you've been awake 10 minutes. Not occasionally, every morning, you reach for the phone first. Bernard is 71, has been walking 45 minutes, 5 mornings a week since he retired, 6 years. He leaves at 7:15, same route, roughly the same pace every time. His last physical showed HSCP was elevated. Doctor noted it, said it was age, and moved on. His knees have been giving him more trouble in the mornings. He wakes up tired more days than not. He mentioned it to his wife last winter. She said maybe he needed more sleep. He doesn't need more sleep. What Bernard doesn't know is that his morning sequence has been almost perfectly calibrated. Calibration to suppress the biological processes that would make his walk protective rather than costly. Phone at 6:50, coffee at 7, shoes on at 7:10, outside by 7:15. The cortisol curve hasn't peaked. The cellular repair window is still running. The circadian signal fired into artificial light and a news cycle. The walk lands on a body that hasn't finished preparing for it. And it has been doing this for 6 years, 5 mornings a week. Bernard isn't doing anything wrong. Every instruction he's ever received tells him he's doing it right. Douglas is also 71, also walks 45 minutes, same distance, roughly. He leaves at 9:30. He started later because that's when his schedule allowed it. The later start was accommodation, not strategy. His inflammatory markers are optimal. His epigenetic clock shows him running 4 years younger than his chronological age. Bernard's shows him running 2 years older, the same exercise, a 6-year divergence in biological aging. Bernard thinks his knees are the price of being 71. He's doing everything his doctor recommended. The blood work confirms the cardiovascular benefits are real, and they are for Bernard too. But the inflammatory accumulation has been running in a register his standard panel doesn't measure. Nobody looked at that register. Nothing in the system prompted anyone to look. He goes out every morning at 7:15 because every signal available to him says it's working. There's a third person worth knowing about. Carol is 68. She was Bernard. Not in name, but in pattern. Walk at 7 a.m., 5 days a week, 7 years of it. Tired most mornings, stiff through the first hour of every day. HSCP elevated at her last 2 physicals, both times attributed to age. Both times she accepted that. 18 months ago, she shifted the walk to 9:15, not because of this research, she hadn't read it, but because a friend suggested they walk together. And that's when the friend was free. Accommodation, not strategy. Same as Douglas. At her most recent physical, 14 months after the shift, her HSCP had dropped to optimal range for the first time in 4 years. Her physician noted it, called it a good sign, but didn't ask what changed. Margaret didn't connect it to the timing either. She told her daughter she'd been sleeping better, that her knees felt more predictable, that mornings didn't feel like something to get through anymore. She hadn't changed what she ate, hadn't added supplements, hadn't changed the distance or pace of the walk. The one variable that moved was when the walk happened relative to waking. That's the signal. Not dramatic, not a transformation, just a body receiving the same input in a biological window that was finally prepared to use it correctly. Margaret's results don't prove the mechanism. One person's outcome never does, but they're coherent with everything the mechanism predicts, and they took 18 months to accumulate, which is exactly the timescale the research would expect. The accumulation, that caused the problem run slow. The resolution runs at the same pace. That's a reason to start now. You deserve to understand why your doctor hasn't told you this, not because they missed something obvious, because the research framework that asks this specific question, the intersection of chronobiology, aging biology, and inflammatory medicine is less than a decade old. The studies that established morning exercise as beneficial for older adults measured outcomes visible on standard assessments like cardiovascular, fitness, and mobility. Those benefits are real. The research is solid. What those studies weren't designed to measure was circadian stratified inflammatory accumulation across years of repeated early morning exercise on an aging baseline. That's a different question. It requires a different design. The field that can answer it properly barely existed 10 years ago. Guidelines lag, research by years. Physicians work from guidelines. There's a structural reason this gap persists. Clinical guidelines are built from large-scale trials. Large-scale trials require funding, institutional coordination, and years of data collection. The question of whether exercise timing affects long-term inflammatory outcomes in adults over 65 has not been funded at that scale yet. What exists is mechanistic research, cross-sectional data, and smaller intervention studies, enough to understand the pathway, not enough to move a guideline. The frustrating part isn't that the information doesn't exist. It does. It exists in research, literature most physicians aren't reading or weren't trained on. The gap between what the emerging science now shows and what the standard advice still says is wide enough to swallow years of mornings. That's not a failure of your physician. It's a structural feature of how medicine updates slowly, formally at the pace of funded trials and committees. So the advice calibrated for a 45-year-old body has not been formally revised for a 70-year-old one. Not because it's wrong, but because the revision hasn't arrived yet. And until it does, the gap stays open. You're not being failed. You're ahead of the update. And the update, when it arrives, will say what the mechanism already shows. The adjustment will be the same, whether you make it now or wait 5 years for the literature to formally catch up. The only difference is the 5 years. A study of older adults found that concentrating activity in the afternoon rather than the morning showed measurably better blood lipid profiles. Same exercise volume, same bodies, different metabolic outcomes. One study, cross-sectional, doesn't establish causation, but the mechanism it points to is coherent, and the adjustment it suggests costs nothing. The cost of waiting for the definitive data accumulates in the same cells the question is about. Before the next appointment, one conversation is worth having, not an argument, not a challenge, but a question your physician can actually engage with. Ask for your HSCP. If it's been measured, ask what the trend has been across your last 3 panels. Not just whether it's in range, but whether it's been moving. Number that's technically within range, but has been rising steadily over 4 years is a different signal than a number that's been stable. The trend is what matters. Most patients never ask for the trend. Most physicians don't volunteer it unless it's crossed a threshold. If it hasn't been measured recently, ask for it. It's a standard marker and a reasonable request. Then ask one more question, whether there's any reason the timing of your physical activity might affect your inflammatory markers. You don't need to cite the research. The question itself opens a door. A physician engaged with the current literature will know what you're pointing at. You're not asking them to revise your protocol on the spot. You're asking them to look at a specific number and think about it in a specific context. That's the kind of conversation that moves the standard of your own care forward independently of whether the guidelines have caught up yet. The information governing your morning routine right now is outdated. So what do you actually do with this? Not a morning overhaul. The walk stays, the exercise stays. 3 things move light first before anything else outside, within 20 minutes of waking, not through glass. Glass filters the short wavelength light your suprachiasmatic nucleus uses to calibrate the cortisol response. 5 minutes on an overcast morning outdoors does more for your circadian signal than an hour next to the brightest indoor light you own. This is not a large ask. It's standing in a doorway with a coffee mug. The threshold is low. The upstream effect is not no phone during those 5 minutes. This isn't a wellness suggestion. Amygdala activation from news in the first 20 minutes produces a cortisol spike that disrupts the natural awakening response. Every morning you check the news first. You are actively interfering with your own anti-inflammatory system. The 5 minutes outside without the phone is not optional. If the rest of this is going to work, then wait on the first meal. 60 to 90 minutes after waking, not as a diet strategy, the molecular pathway sustaining autophagy, your overnight cellular repair, stays active as long as the fasting state holds. The 2024 Nature Cell Biology research confirmed this mechanism. Eating activates mTOR and the repair window closes 60 to 90 minutes, extends it without changing what you eat or how much you eat. Research on time-restricted eating in older adults specifically shows lower inflammatory markers and reduced accumulation of cardiac cellular damage that drives heart disease than exercise. After 90 minutes, the same walk Douglas takes at 9:30, received by a body whose cortisol curve has stabilized, whose anti-inflammatory response has activated, whose cellular repair window has closed on its own terms rather than being cut short. The workout hasn't changed. The distance hasn't changed. The effort hasn't changed. What's changed is the biological context the workout lands in. And that context is what determines whether the inflammatory signal the exercise generates gets resolved cleanly or accumulates incrementally across years. The workout is identical to what Bernard does at 7:15. The biology receiving it is not. 2021 study using epigenetic clocks found that lifestyle interventions targeting morning behavior reduced biological age by an average of 3.23 years in 8 weeks. Not medication, not a new exercise program, just when things happen, not whether they happen. 323 years in 8 weeks. One thing the research requires being honest about this cost is not identical for everyone over 65. Individuals with high cardiorespiratory fitness tend to have more robust cortisol awakening responses than sedentary peers. If you've been consistently active for decades and your inflammatory markers are genuinely optimal, your morning biology may be managing this better than the average. The timing cost scales with the degree of inflammaging and response blunting, both of which vary between individuals, and your standard panel doesn't directly measure. The honest signal to watch is not your cholesterol, it's your HSCP. It's your morning energy pattern across weeks, not days. It's whether the stiffness is improving with the exercise, habit, or persisting alongside it. Those signals in aggregate tell you more about your actual morning inflammatory context than any single number on a panel that wasn't designed to ask this question. This is also still emerging research, not settled consensus. The large-scale trials examining exercise timing, specifically in adults over 65, have not been completed. What the current evidence supports is a low-cost adjustment with no downside risk and mechanistic support from multiple converging lines of research. That's a different claim from a guarantee. It's also more honest than most of what you've been told. 30 years after 65 is not a single outcome. Research tracking over 2,500 adults found that lifestyle factors predicted mortality risk. People running biologically younger were maintaining physical function, cognitive clarity, and independence into their late 80s and 90s at rates their chronological peers were not. The divergence didn't begin at 80. It was already established and compounding by 70. The daily habits at 68 were determining which trajectory the body was on, not the habits adopted at 82 in response to decline. The window for this is not later. It's the mornings you're already showing up for, the stiffness, the fatigue, the inflammation your doctor keeps noting and attributing to the decade you're in. It may not be the price of being 71. It may be 6 years of the right walk at the wrong hour. The clock moves 90 minutes. Everything else stays exactly as it